Hey, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the peripheral nervous system and get into a little bit of the anatomy and the physiology of the cranial nerves today. All right, so first let's kind of review the structure of nerves in general. So remember that nerves and tracts are just bundles of axons, right? So the way that your nervous system works is that we've got these cell bodies that tend to be aggregated together, and when those cell bodies are aggregated together, we refer to them as either ganglia or nuclei, depending on where they are. And then the axons also get bundled together and those bundles of axons are either called nerves or tracts, depending on where they are in the body. So these nerves or tracts are going to be um, kind of bundled together in a similar way that muscle cells were bound together. So remember that muscle cells, individual muscle fibers were wrapped in each in their own sheet of connective tissue, and then groups of fibers were collected and wrapped in a sheet of connective tissue, and then groups of fibers were bundled. And that's the same structure that we've got going on here. So every single axon is going to be surrounded by a sheet of connective tissue called an endoneurium. So endoneurium. And then groups of axons are going to be bound together. A group of axons is called a fascicle, the same way a group of muscle fibers was called a fascicle. So that group of axons then gets surrounded by perineurium. And then we have a whole bunch of fascicles that are bound together. Those fascicles bound together and get wrapped with another layer of connective tissue called epineurium. Okay, so as far as your peripheral nerves go, so peripheral nerves are just the nerves that are branching off of your brain and your spinal cord and then are going out to innervate all the different pieces and parts of your body. We've got 31 pairs of spinal nerves that branch off of your spinal cord. So these are paired nerves. So each one exists in a pair branching off of the left and right side of the spinal cord. And then these nerves just branch out and get smaller and smaller and smaller, and they go to innervate all the different parts of your body. All right, so you have 31 pairs, and they're basically numbered just the way that we numbered the vertebrae. And the only difference here is that with your vertebrae, you have 7 cervical vertebrae. Here we've got 8 pairs of cranial nerve or 8 pairs of cervical nerves. And that's because you've got 1 pair of cervical nerves that comes out before the first cervical vertebrae and 1 pair that comes out after. So 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and then 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. All right. And each of these nerves is going to be important for innervating a certain region of the surface of the body. So the superficial area that a nerve innervates, we refer to as its dermatome. So the dermatome is a region of skin that we can trace back to being innervated by one particular nerve, one particular spinal nerve. So for example, the cervical nerves C6 and C7, those are the ones that are going to innervate your index finger and your thumb. So we can trace that all the way back to the C6 and C7 cervical nerves. Same so T4 seems to be right around the nipple line. T10 seems to innervate the umbilicus, which is your belly button. And then the lumbar cervical or the lumbar nerves are the ones that are mostly responsible for innervating your lower half. Okay. All right. So um, a lot of times we like to think of nerves as just branching off and then simply going to the place that it innervates. They are not that simple. So sometimes nerves will branch off of the spinal cord and then they kind of intertwine and braid around one another. So when we have a tangle of nerves like that, that's kind of twisted around one another, we refer to that as a plexus. So a plexus is a group of nerves that are kind of wrapped together or wound together. All right, so you've got a few major nerve plexuses in your body. One is the cervical plexus, so you can guess where that one is. You've got a brachial plexus, and then you've also got a lumbosacral plexus. So let's look a little bit more closely at some of these plexuses. All right, so cervical plexus is in the neck. So this is the branches of your first cervical vertebrae through your fifth, or first cervical nerve through your fifth cervical nerve. So those C1 through C5 nerves branch off of the spinal cord, and then they kind of start twisting together. And that twisting together is what we refer to as the cervical plexus. And then after they kind of branch together, then they branch apart again and form other nerves. So one of the important other nerves that's formed that originates from the cervical plexus is called your phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve is sort of a combination of what originally was cervical nerves 3 through 5. That phrenic nerve goes to innervate your diaphragm. So diaphragm is really important muscle for breathing. If the diaphragm isn't functioning properly, then you're not going to be able to take a breath. So the phrenic nerve is going to be important for innervating the diaphragm. All right. Um, Down a little bit inferior to the cervical plexus, we'll come across the brachial plexus. So brachial plexus is going to be a combination of cervical nerves 5 through 8 and also the thoracic, first thoracic nerve. So again, these branch off of the spinal cord and then they sort of intertwine and wrap around one another to become that brachial plexus. And then the nerves that arise from that brachial plexus are going to supply the shoulders and the upper limbs. All right, so here's some important nerves that are coming from that brachial plexus. So we can see cervical nerves 5 through 8 and the first thoracic nerve braid together to form this brachial plexus. And then the major nerves that branch off of the brachial plexus are going to be the axillary nerves. And guess where that goes? The radial nerve, median nerve, and ulnar nerve. All right, so these are the nerves that go to innervate the arm. Okay. A brief note on what a palsy is. So, a palsy is when you've got an injury to a nerve. So, Erb's palsy is when there's been damage to the brachial plexus. So this brachial plexus injury can happen a lot of times during childbirth. So as a baby is being delivered, sometimes the head and the neck are kind of pulled in such a way that you do damage to this brachial plexus, and that can result in Erb's palsy, which is pictured here in this slide. This can happen in adults as well if there's any kind of damage to that brachial plexus. All right. A median nerve injury. So the median nerve, it goes right down the middle of the arm. So the median nerve injury is going to cause numbness and tingling in the fingers. Carpal tunnel syndrome is an example of a median nerve injury. So this happens when you've got inflammation underneath the carpal tunnel, which is a ligament that holds some of your carpals together. When you've got inflammation under there, there's no room for the tissue to stretch. So pressure gets put on that median nerve, which causes carpal tunnel syndrome. All right, so your ulnar nerve is a nerve that runs along the medial side of your arm. It goes down the ulnar aspect of the forearm. But as it's kind of running down your arm and down to the ulnar aspect of the forearm, it wraps around the outside of the elbow. And where it wraps around the outside of the elbow, it is very exposed. So it's the largest sort of unprotected nerve in your body. So there's no muscle or bone overlying it at that region at the back of your elbow. So when you strike that, you're actually you're hitting a nerve. So people say, "Oh, you hit your funny bone, and that's why it hurts so much." You're actually hitting a very exposed nerve right there. Okay, and then moving down to this lumbar plexus. So lumbar plexus is a branch of the lumbar nerves 1 through 4. They braid together and then they branch off of that. The femoral nerve is one of the largest nerves that comes off of this lumbar plexus. All right, and then the sacral plexus, this is going to have lumbar nerves 4 and 5, and then sacral nerves 1 through 4 that branch off of the spinal cord, twist together to form the sacral plexus. And then the largest nerve in the body branches from the sacral plexus. So that largest nerve in the body is called the sciatic nerve. So sciatic nerve branches from that sacral plexus and then goes on to supply the lower limbs. All right. Let's talk about reflexes for a second. A reflex, specifically a spinal reflex, is one where we get a very quick response to a stimulus because the signal goes from the afferent neuron, so sensory neuron, taking that information to an integrating neuron. That integration takes place in the spinal cord rather than going all the way up to the brain. So we get a really quick integration at the spinal cord, and then we get the efferent neuron, the motor neuron, taking this reflex action out to the affected tissue, which is muscle tissue. Right. So in this picture, you can kind of see it looks like someone has maybe stepped on a tack or hit a nail here or something. So the signal goes, the pain that's triggered by this is going to go through this afferent neuron all the way. See where our dorsal root ganglion here, all the way into the spinal cord. Then we synapse with the integration neuron. Then we synapse again with the efferent motor neuron out the ventral side of the spinal cord into the effector tissue, which in this case is skeletal muscle. So it's going to trigger us to step away from the thing that just hurt us. So that's a basic withdrawal reflex. All right. So some other reflexes here. So the patellar reflex. The patellar reflex is one of those things that the doctor is checking when they use this little hammer thing here to kind of they knock on your patellar ligament. So that patellar ligament is connecting the. It's an extension of the quadriceps tendon that stretches over the patella and then reaches down to connect to the tibia. When you put pressure on it, it will make you kick. So it makes you kick because it pulls on that tendon. So that's a quick reflex. All right, and then also the Achilles reflex. So in addition to the patellar reflex, this is another one. If you apply pressure to the Achilles tendon, which is also called the calcaneal tendon, that's on the back of your heel. And it would cause normally would cause contraction of the calf muscles. If you don't see that reflex, then we can say that there's something wrong. Probably there's probably been damage to the lumbosacral plexus. All right, another reflex here, the Babinski reflex, sometimes called the plantar flexion reflex. So this is a weird one that's kind of different in adults than it is in children. So in adults, if you touch the sole of someone's foot, then normally that's going to cause them to curl their toes, so to kind of flex the toes. In a baby, it's going to be the opposite. So if you touch a baby's foot, they're going to extend the toes or kind of drag them back. So different in adults versus infants. Okay, moving on to cranial nerves. So we talked about your 31 pairs of spinal nerves and all of the plexuses that branch off of those spinal nerves. Now we're going to talk about the 12 pairs of nerves that branch off of the inferior aspect of your brain. So here's an inferior view of the brain, and here listed are the 12 cranial nerves that branch off of the inferior view of the brain. Yes, you have to know all of them. You have to know what they do, and and you should know the numbers associated with them, so the Roman numerals associated with each one of these nerves. So we're going to go through them one at a time, and hopefully these will start to kind of sink in by the time we're done here today. All right, so here's another view of these 12 cranial nerves. So this is a cadaver that's been really expertly dissected so that you can see where those cranial nerves are actually branching off of the base of the brain and where they are headed to. All right, so starting off with cranial nerve number 1. So cranial nerve number 1 is called your olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is sensory for smell. So that means this is the nerve that's responsible for delivering sensory information that comes from your nose. So any kind of chemical that you inhale in through your nose, any particle that comes in through your nose. So here's a kind of sagittal view. So if we breathe something in, the little particles that we breathe in are going to go into our nasal cavity. They're going to reach this olfactory epithelium, which is these epithelial cells that are on the roof of the nasal cavity. Those particles are going to trigger, the particles that you inhaled are going to trigger an action potential in those olfactory neurons that action potential is going to get sent up to this olfactory bulb. So the olfactory bulb, I'll highlight it over here as well. Olfactory bulb is attached to the olfactory tract. So here's the olfactory tract, which goes directly to the brain. So your olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1, is responsible for your sense of smell. All right, cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. Optic nerve is sensory nerve for sight. So this is a nerve that major nerve branches off the base of the spinal cord. So you can see the I'll switch colors here. So you can see the olfactory, or I'm sorry, the optic chiasm here. So optic chiasm I'm circling as a place where these two optic nerves cross over, and then they go forward to the posterior aspect of each one of your eyeballs. So optic nerve is responsible for sight. So all the light that's hitting your retina in your eyeball is going to trigger action potentials in those nerves, in those neurons, and that information is going to be sent back through the optic nerve to be processed as visual information in the brain. Okay. Now we're going to get a little bit out of numerical order here because I want to talk about the rest of the cranial nerves that are involved in your sense of or involved in vision. So cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 are going to be important for your extraocular muscles. So we talked about these extraocular muscles when we talked about muscles last week. So the extraocular muscles, remember, are your superior, inferior, medial, and lateral rectus, and then your superior oblique and your inferior oblique. So 6 extraocular muscles that control the movement of your eyeballs, essentially. So the 3 cranial nerves that are going to be important for those are cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear nerve, and cranial nerve 6, which is called the abducens nerve. So cranial nerve 3, in addition to supplying most of your extraocular muscles, also helps operate your eyelid and facilitates pupillary constriction. So that means it controls the size of your pupils to help you focus in high light and low light situations. Right, so oculomotor nerve is responsible for most of those extraocular muscles. These other 2 nerves, so cranial nerves 4 and cranial nerve 6, are just there to operate one single muscle each. All right, so cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, only operates the superior oblique extraocular muscle. So it just operates that one little muscle that allows you to look diagonally. And then cranial nerve 6, the abducens, only operates the lateral rectus. So only operates the lateral rectus on each side, which basically means that the lateral rectus, when you flex it, is going to pull your eye. It's going to abduct the eye. So remember, abducens abducts the eye. All right, so we did 3, 4, and 6. We skipped over 5 because 5 is not necessarily involved with the movement of the eyeball. So cranial nerve 5 is your trigeminal nerve. This is a major sensory nerve of your face. So this is involved in facial sensation. We've got 3 major branches of the trigeminal nerve. So the ophthalmic branches near your eye, so sensory to your forehead and sensory to your eye. The maxillary branch, which goes kind of here to your maxilla, and then the mandibular branch, which goes down to the mandible. So it's sensory for the face, lets you feel sensations of your face, is also a motor nerve. So it controls some muscles involved in chewing or mastication. So that's your trigeminal nerve or cranial nerve 5. All right, so we already did cranial nerve 6 when we talked about the eyeball. Cranial nerve 7 is your facial nerve. So cranial nerve 7 innervates a lot of the muscles associated with facial expression. So happy face, sad face, any kind of movement of your face. The muscles involved in those movements are probably going to be innervated by cranial nerve 7, which is your facial nerve. In addition to being motor for facial expression, there is also a sensory aspect of this nerve. So it's going to be sensory for some part of your sense of taste. So the anterior 2/3 of your tongue is going to be innervated here to give you a sense of taste in that region. Right. Cranial nerve 8 is your vestibulocochlear nerve. So vestibulocochlear nerve is a sensory nerve for your sense of hearing and your sense of balance. So two senses that are controlled in the inner ear. Cranial nerve 8 runs into the inner ear to control your sense of hearing and your sense of balance. All right, cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Anytime you see that root glosso refers to tongue. So in this case, glossopharyngeal is referring to the tongue and the pharynx. So pharyngeal referring to the pharynx, which is the throat. So glossopharyngeal nerve is going to innervate um, regions of the tongue and throat. So some taste sensations are here. So we've got sensory for taste, and we've also got motor for certain glands. So salivary glands that are going to be responsible for creating saliva in order to moisten food that you bring into your mouth. It's going to be controlled by this glossopharyngeal nerve. All right, and then cranial nerve 10. So this one's going to be a little bit different than most of the other ones. So you might have noticed the pattern so far with these cranial nerves is that they tend to innervate things in the head, and they tend to be associated with some of your special senses like smelling, sight, hearing, balance. Cranial nerve 10 is sort of the exception to this. So it's also called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve tends to wander all over the body. So it's carrying a lot of important impulses to the major organs in your thorax and in your abdomen. So it's carrying signals to your heart, to your lungs. It's carrying digestive signals. Um, Think of your cranial nerve 10 as being the major nerve of your parasympathetic nervous system. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about what parasympathetic nervous tone means, but essentially you can think of it as your rest and digest response. So, parasympathetic tone is elevated when you're doing things like eating food or just sitting and relaxing, when you're sleeping. You've got increased parasympathetic tone. And that's the vagus nerve is carrying that parasympathetic tone to all these major organs. So it's telling your heart to calm down. It's telling your breathing to calm down. It's telling your digestion to increase. That's all cranial nerve 10 or the vagus nerve. All right, cranial nerve 11 is called your spinal accessory nerve. Spinal accessory nerve is a motor nerve that just controls, again, just a couple muscles here, the sternocleidomastoid, which you remember is this one right here, and then the trapezius, which is the one in the back of your neck. So sternocleidomastoid is basically responsible for movement of the neck. And then cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. So again, we see that root glossal in there. So hypo means below. So this cranial nerve 12 innervates the region below the tongue. So this one is mostly controlling the muscle coordination of the tongue, which is trickier than you might think. So your tongue is a really powerful muscle, and it's the movements of your tongue have to control things like chewing, talking, swallowing. These are all really tricky things to do. They're all innervated by cranial nerve 12 or your hypoglossal nerve. All right, so hopefully this is going to help you start to remember those cranial nerves. It's hard to memorize, I know. There are some mnemonic devices out there that you can use, so you can look up. There are some on your learning maps. I'm sure you can find others on YouTube. So take some time and try to memorize those 12 cranial nerves. Let me know if you have any questions about them. So let's go through these questions real quick here. So what exits and enters the spinal cord between the vertebrae? And then where do we find the following plexuses? Right, so the answer there is the spinal nerves. So spinal nerves are entering and exiting the spinal cord between each one of the vertebrae. And then where do we find the cervical plexus in the neck? Brachial plexus is in your shoulder, and the lumbosacral plexus is in your pelvis. All right, what's the phrenic nerve? Where does that phrenic nerve originate? What's the ulnar nerve? Where does it originate, and what do we commonly refer to it as? All right, so the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. It originates from cranial nerves 3 through 5. The ulnar nerve is the major nerve on the medial aspect of the arm. It originates from the brachial plexus, and when you hit it, you call it your funny bone. Last set of questions here. What's the name for the third cranial nerve? So think of what your third cranial nerve is. The seventh cranial nerve, is that going to be a sensory nerve, a motor nerve, or both? And then what is the name of the eighth cranial nerve? All right, so name of the third cranial nerve is your oculomotor nerve. The seventh cranial nerve is both sensory and motor. And then the eighth cranial nerve is your vestibulocochlear. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.